Hello and welcome to the Beyond Limits podcast. I'm Jermaine Benjamin, one of the directors at Transition Partners, and this podcast is where we invite leaders from the talent, HR and culture sphere to discuss everything to do with attracting, retaining and developing people. And today, I'm really pleased to be joined by Jonny Hiles from Answer. So thanks for joining me, mate.
No, thanks for having me, Jermaine. Awesome to be here.
Good to have you on. So, as always, I'd like for you to start, Jonny. If you could give us just a bit of a backdrop into kind of your experience and your journey to where you are now, that would be amazing.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, I always thought my journey to recruitment was a bit of a strange one because I kind of fell into it, and I think the more I speak to people kind of doing our jobs, the more common it seems to be. But I went to uni, studied criminology and forensic science because I really wanted to join the police force, and then after kind of getting to final year, massive recruitment freeze, not recruiting police for ages and ages, and I kind of quickly realised that dream wasn't really going to happen. Now, my auntie at the time, she was a director for a recruitment company, kind of told me about sort of the job of recruitment and the idea of sort of hiring people to help businesses grow, and the fact that kind of the most part the reward you get and what you get out of it is kind of dependent on the work you put in. So I was sold. Yeah, it was kind of me hooked. Ended up working for a couple of small agencies in Leeds, and whilst I could kind of fill roles, source people, and kind of I really enjoyed that part, I could not sort of business development for the life of me. I really struggled with that. And then in my last agency, I was responsible for managing the CL1 framework for Capita, which was like all central gov stuff. I really enjoyed that, kind of enjoyed the volume and the challenging kind of nature of the roles, but it often felt quite sort of transactional. And I realised I really wanted to work internally and kind of have a chance to make a difference to sort of how companies recruit and the challenges around finding people. So my first internal role was in Jet2, doing all their sort of tech digital hiring. Ended up working for Sky and kind of helping with the Leeds doc sort of setup. And in the last 7-8 years, I've been working predominantly for software consultancies. Most recently joined Answer in October as their TA lead. So kind of that's my journey really.
What have you noticed? Because there's a few different industries there. You've got travel, Sky, entertainment and various other bits as well. And then obviously moving into kind of tech consultancy. What have you seen in terms of the different environments?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of the challenges are the same, certainly from kind of a tech and digital pool. I think all kind of companies are really feeling that pinch of trying to find tech talent and kind of people in the digital space. So I think from my point of view, it was really interesting working in different businesses and seeing how, I remember in like my first week in Jet2, the induction, kind of doing a pushback on the runway at Leeds Bradford Airport, pushing like sat watching planes get pushed, which was really cool. But yeah, I think kind of even in, like you said, entertainment and travel being massive industries, that in terms of the differences, there's still the same issues there in trying to find kind of great people in tech.
And give us a bit of a backdrop then. More recently, you mentioned working software consultancies and obviously present up to Answer. Tell us a little bit about kind of what you've been doing at Answer since joining and what you're involved in there.
Yeah, so the last kind of 6 months or so at Answer, it's been really, really cool because I've been managed to get involved in hiring some great people and kind of seeing them kind of join the business, but also kind of get involved in making some changes to a few of the policies and processes we've got. So we've done a new referral policy to try and hopefully kind of bring a bit more clarity and some focus to hiring internal referrals. We've made some changes to our career site and interview process just to try and make sure that the kind of recruitment process reflects how inclusive we are as a business. We've refreshed our recruitment channels, so looking at making sure we're working with the best tools to try and attract people. And there's some kind of new tools we're looking at using this year, which I'm really excited about. And then kind of rolling out some lunch and learn sessions just to try and kind of get around our interviewing process, to try and kind of get a benchmark around there's some kind of really knowledgeable and really passionate people in our business around interviewing and trying to capture their knowledge and share it across the business. So lots to get on with, but all real good stuff.
Yeah, there's pretty wide remit there, isn't there? Couple of bits I wanted to pick up on in there, and around what you spoke about before, you mentioned it just then, is around making changes to your interview process and the policies, and in particular around inclusivity. You mentioned when we spoke before about neurodivergent candidates or inclusivity in a wider spectrum, I suppose. And then you also mentioned about values focused. So just interested if you could kind of touch upon those bits for us, really.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there's some really interesting research out there. I know a talk I went to last year that Haystack did around kind of looking at the value of the kind of motivators and drivers for people when changing jobs. And one of the things that came out top was often making sure the business's values are reflected through the recruitment process. So it's all well and good kind of talking about what your values are and what your culture is as a business, but if how you recruit doesn't reflect that, then it's really hard for candidates to sort of get a sense check for what the business is like. You can talk about all this amazing stuff you do, but then if your kind of recruitment process is really restricted and really rigid, it doesn't sort of, what you're saying and what you're doing are two very different things, and often that can put a lot of people off. And I definitely kind of felt that as a business answer is super inclusive. There's some amazing people who work here, and I often felt at times our recruitment process just doesn't reflect that. So I think for us, we kind of have a set process, but there's things that we can kind of deviate and change to fit around people. So typically we have kind of two stages. The first being a bit more of a sort of a technical interview where you kind of run through kind of your experience, the stuff you've done, that kind of day-to-day element, and then the second stage being a lot more kind of value and culture driven. And I think giving flexibility to allow people to maybe have those stages, remote if they kind of don't want to travel, or likewise if people prefer being face to face and kind of find that awkward, kind of doing interviews over video awkward, can do them both, face to face. Having kind of that flexibility where if we've got people who are actively looking and they're kind of in a rush, not necessarily in a rush, but kind of want to pressure, kind of getting through the process as quick as they can, doing them almost back to back and having them as a one stage where we can kind of box both things off. And it's, if someone's out of work, they've been made redundant and they're really kind of interviewing with 6, 7 or 8 companies and they want to try and kind of almost get through them as quick as they can, then we can kind of be flexible there. And I think from kind of covering that sort of neurodivergent piece, we were really keen to put as much information on our website and our career site just to support people through the interview process. I think there's that kind of almost stigma where you think of interviews kind of setting people up for failure, and it's all about, whereas for us it's the other way around. We want to give people as much tools as they can to succeed, and kind of for some people that's doing loads of prep and kind of they want to know who they're meeting and what kind of, and for other people they can kind of wing it. And I think for us it's just about making sure everyone's got that same kind of platform to succeed.
And just going back on that, I really like that kind of mentality, for lack of a better word, around setting people up to succeed in the interview, almost to really get, from what I'm hearing, to get the best out of them.
Absolutely.
Yeah. That's interesting, because I think occasionally there are some organisations that still maybe have a perspective of, it is that let's catch them out or let's see where their knowledge gap is. Yeah, how do you feel that's gone?
Completely agree. Yeah, I think interviewing's a real strange one, because it's like you're taking people who do a job and then they require a skill that's not necessarily in line with their job, and then you're interviewing people about how good they are at their job with a skill that they may not necessarily. It's just, I find it really, so for us, I think, like you said, it's all about giving people the kind of the platform to succeed. And we sort of tell people before they join the interview kind of what the questions will be, give them, people as much sort of chance to prepare. Because I think for us, we're not there to try and catch people out and sort of set people up for failure. It's just about giving people as much chance as they can to showcase their skills, showcase what they're great at, and then likewise kind of give people a chance to ask the people in the interview as many questions and get a real feel for the business. I don't know if you felt the same, but it's definitely felt like the last kind of couple of years before lockdown, there's a real shift where it's, everyone's talked about the market being candidate driven, but it's really felt that way. You kind of, you need, the interview is as much an opportunity to sell the business as it is to kind of make sure the candidates are right. So I think, we tell people who they're meeting, the kind of questions they should ask, all that kind of stuff, because we want to just make sure we're right for the business as much as they are for us.
Yeah, I really like that, and your point there about even giving them the questions and that chance to showcase. That's the word you use. I really like that. What would you say to someone then who maybe has a slightly different opinion of, if you're setting them up in that way, you might not, you're not necessarily getting maybe under the surface of any gaps or areas that they don't have expertise wise? Or would you say that's the kind of wrong way to look at it?
Yeah, so I think that the interview, if a candidate's prepared and they know the questions they've got and they can give examples of all their experience, and the interview is the chance for us to deep dive into that, so you can really find out, like, okay, well, what did you do? What was the, and you can really sort of probe him. So I think we've not really had that many instances where you can kind of bluff it through an interview, because you can always kind of probe a bit deeper. But yeah, I think, like you said, it's that mindset of allowing people the chance to succeed, and for some people that's really easy and they can kind of walk in without any prep, and they can really kind of nail down an interview. And for others, they need a bit more preparation, and I don't think that necessarily makes candidates great or not, because they need more help preparing. I think it's about it's that kind of a balance between equality and equity, isn't it? Giving everyone the fair chance to shine.
I really like that. Yeah, it's a really interesting point. And again, it is back to equality and equity. Like, two people maybe have the same competency in a role, but one just isn't strong at preparing.
And that doesn't necessarily mean they're bad at a job. It just means they're potentially maybe not as strong an interviewer. But once you've got the job, you don't really use your interviewing skills for that much else.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And then just with your experience, you've been agency side, you've been client side, you've worked in various different environments. Given your experience, what have you seen that's kind of been the best couple of bits of best practice, not the best sentence or wording, but what have you seen that's been really, really effective that you maybe have taken to other roles or other jobs that you've done? And what are some of the, thinking about the audience listening as well, what are some of the bits that, you've seen that, you would probably advise or you have steered away from going forward?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the kind of biggest lessons from a best practice point of view for me was having the confidence to sort of question doing things in the right way. I think really early on in my career, I was really focused on kind of just filling roles and very kind of cost saving and delivery focused. I remember I used to have an Excel spreadsheet where I track like all the hires I've made directly and compare that to an agency saving, and kind of very sort of delivery kind of driven. And I think, obviously, don't get me wrong, that's super important. Recruiting people is kind of our job and our skill. But I think for me, it's maybe learning a bit more about the kind of, maybe from the mistakes I've made, but it feels like the focus should be on hiring the right people and kind of hiring the right way, both from a candidate and from a kind of a business point of view. I think really kind of making that effort to sort of understand the company culture you're in, and even kind of the more siloed cultures of the teams you're recruiting for, being really transparent and sort of talking about the good stuff as well as the bad, really, and the challenges. I think every business has its kind of its own issues and its own problems, and often like that's kind of what makes work challenging and what makes work fun. And I think just transparency when speaking to candidates. Obviously, if you're speaking to someone and their main driver is career progression, and that's what they want and that's why they're looking, and if the business you work for is the organization's fairly flat in structure and they're not going to have opportunities to get a promotion every 6 months, then they're probably not going to be right for the role you're recruiting for. And it's just about being transparent, really. And then I think ensuring, obviously we kind of talked about how important sort of values and culture are, focusing on making sure the recruitment processes, the candidates it's not just about whether someone's technically right, it's more, do they align with the business and what you kind of, from a cultural and values perspective, what you want. I know for us, Answer, that's sort of really, really important, and even kind of half of our recruitment process is just on values and culture, and it's kind of a very transparent conversation around sort of, this is us as a business, this is what our values are, this is what they mean to us, how does that fit with you, is that what you want to do, is that kind of what you're passionate about? And like I said, it's just about making sure we're right for people as they are for us. I think I remember doing my CIPD, and there was a ridiculous fact that like the cost of a bad hire is like between 40 and 60 grand when you work in kind of the time of interviewers spent and kind of all the resources you need and all that stuff. So I think I've kind of almost learned the hard way that there's it's way more important to get it right than it is to kind of than to kind of not.
And I remember we were speaking a couple of weeks ago, and this ties into what kind of your answer now and what you were talking about earlier. You were talking about how your interviews are quite conversational. Tell me a little bit about how that flows, really.
Yeah, really well, I think. I've observed a few and sort of seen them, and it often at times kind of does feel like more of a two-way chat than a one-way thing. It's not often with some of the kind of tech interview. There's maybe a sort of a 10-15 minute kind of whiteboard presentation sort of exercise to run through, but then the rest of the hour is more kind of talking about the projects we're involved with, some of our headaches, and kind of just been like, how would you solve them, kind of thing. And I think we try and keep it almost like this, just as like a conversation, because it's the way you get the best out of people. I think if it's like a set of 15, 16 questions that's very regimented and you kind of awkwardly moving from one to the other, it doesn't feel quite right. It feels quite transactional. So I think for us, it's more about kind of having that two-way flow as quick as we can to kind of get the best. Because I think when candidates are relaxed and they feel like they're talking to someone they can relate to, they're more likely to ask questions and kind of walk away feeling like they know our business much better. Whereas if you just grill someone for an hour and they kind of leave sort of mopping the brow thinking, oh, I've got to survive that, they've not really got anything out of it.
Yeah, that's great. And I get completely from the candidate experience perspective. That's excellent. But also, I assume that from the interviewer's perspective, it's probably better as well, that the interviewers, hiring managers, feel that they can go in there without having to be as regimented and more conversational.
Absolutely. And I think from kind of a TA point of view, we're asking, interviewers to give up a good chunk of their day. An interview could last like an hour, and then you've got the prep either side of that, all that stuff. And I think kind of from a recruitment point of view, if you can make that interview as good an experience for the person doing the interview, you're more likely to get availability, you're more likely to get people invested in doing it. If it's hard work for them and it's a slog for, an hour or so, when you're trying to request, availability for people to do interviews, it's going to be tough to do, it's kind of, so it's that cycle of if you can make it as good as possible, you get more buy-in, you get more people doing it, it kind of makes your life a bit easier, I suppose.
One of the things that I really wanted to talk to you about again is around what you're doing at Answer to differentiate as an employer of choice, and really there might be a few things you want to mention, but I loved and we spoke about earlier today as well around putting love into the room as a value. So I really wanted you to highlight that for us, because that was just really interesting, I thought.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think kind of a big motivator for the stuff we do as being an employer of choice is driven by the fact we're employee owned. So in 2020, the business went through employee ownership, and it's a real big driver as to why our kind of values and culture are so important. Because if you're an employee owned business and you have a really, horrible, toxic work culture and it's an awful place to be, you're not going to have employees, and you can't really be employee owned without them. So I think for us, there's a real kind of emphasis on making it a great place to be here, which our values kind of underpin. And as you mentioned, bring love into the room. I love it. It's one of our kind of main values. There's a few kind of cool ones. Do the right thing in the right way. Be the reason for change. I think for us as a business, we really are kind of empowered to sort of show how we do those values. It's not like, I think some businesses have values where they're kind of stuff like trust and collaboration. And for me, it kind of, they feel like the bare minimum when you employ people, you should trust them. If you're kind of paying someone a salary, you feel like that's trust should be up there with the things you expect. So I think for us, it's all about, kind of how important are our values and sort of how do we show them. So we try and do it in our kind of interview process. As recruiters, how do we bring love into the room? How do we do stuff like that? I think there's a real emphasis on kind of living and breathing those values. So I think, that's kind of one of the things we try and do as an employer. It can be often it can be challenging at times. So I think when speaking to candidates and kind of being honest, that sort of put love into the room and do the right thing in the right way means you often kind of end up doing a lot more than what's required. If someone asks for help, it's kind of like you want to help them because you kind of, you love the people you work with. But likewise, when you need support and when you need help, you just get so much back from people here. For instance, kind of an example of trying to improve our interview process, having so much input from hiring managers. It's not a case of you have to kind of chase people. People want to make stuff better. People want to improve, and you kind of get a lot of help. So I think our values kind of really underpin trying to make us an employer for choice, really.
And tell me about, you mentioned when I spoke to you earlier on about the reason you joined Answer, was around putting love in the room and how you felt that was a differentiator. We spoke about very briefly, definitely had the same kind of views on this, around, not to be unfair to corporates, but, the traditional, trust, collaboration, it's like, well, you mentioned a moment ago, I mean, that's just the baseline, right? Like,
yeah.
So tell us a bit about that story that kind of attracted to you. From what we see out there, from some of the corporates.
Yeah, absolutely. So I saw Answer at the Leeds Digital Festival last year, and their talk was about putting love into the room. And the idea that kind of love is something a business would prioritise. It sounds really strange, but when you think about it, it makes so much sense, especially in kind of, consultancies where you're people focused, like people are, they're kind of lifeblood of the business. It's kind of everything. So it makes sense, and yeah, I mean, I didn't kind of mean that as a disrespect to what corporate businesses where their values are maybe a little kind of removed from that, like that for some people, that's what they want, and that's cool. But yeah, just watching a talk about how love should be used in a business context, and it's like, it makes sense when you deal with people, when you work with people, like you should love the work you do, who you work with, all that stuff. And I was like, yeah, that sounds cool.
And how do you think, because just playing devil's advocate here, and I completely agree with you. I mentioned to you earlier on, I'm reading a book called Love Works, which is about the foundation of business decisions from leaders being about the people and all the rest of it. But what would you say, the argument, and you will have heard or seen it before in your experience around, well, it's a bit fluffy, it's about results, we've got targets to hit and all the rest of it. What would be your response to that, really, now working in an environment where that is one of the values?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it's a tough one, because I mean, I would argue sort of trust and collaboration can equally be as fluffy if not used in the right way. I think it's more about kind of how you use the values rather than the values themselves, I think. And I think certainly from a delivery point of view, yeah, us as a business, we're kind of driven by delivering and kind of succeeding and all that stuff. It's not that's not the case here, but I think for us, it's more focusing on what brings great delivery. And it's like, yeah, you can focus on the end result, but if you actually focus on hiring great people and making it a great place to work and a great place to be, that kind of takes care of itself, really. Whereas if you focus on the solution, you're kind of ignoring the problem. It's like, yeah, if you focus on delivering great stuff, but then actually, well, how do you do that? And that's kind of whereas if we focus on the how, the end result kind of happens, really.
I really like that. And then you've kind of touched upon this a little bit throughout us conversation we've had so far today, but give us in a bit more detail around what you're working on to improve that candidate attraction, to get that initial buy-in, I suppose, that attraction to you guys as a business. And then you spoke a little bit about that experience of getting it right in terms of attracting people, but then also once that attraction's there, how are you, or what are you doing around that experience that those candidates have in that journey?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the two main areas for kind of Answer to focus on this year around all that attraction and experience stuff is mainly around giving us a bigger voice, and I think ensuring our recruitment process reflects how kind of inclusive we are as a business. So the tech and digital space, obviously, you'll know, is just so competitive, and there's so many companies doing a great job of kind of shouting about their employer brand and kind of really putting their voice out there. We as Answer are an amazing place to work, but I think often we focus on doing great stuff and not necessarily shouting about the great stuff we do. So I think for us, it's all about this year getting involved in more events, doing more white papers, kind of really pushing for a bigger seat at that table. And we've started doing a lot of stuff already this year. So we run a Answer is Women event, which is run by our own amazing women here, and that's not kind of recruitment related. That's all about kind of driving and sort of celebrating some of the incredible women in Yorkshire. But stuff like that, I think we just need to do more of and kind of showcase, actually. there's some awesome stuff we do. So definitely, I think our voice is up there. And then, kind of just making sure, I think our recruitment process is as inclusive as we are as a business. So we definitely kind of, as an organisation, sort of celebrate diversity and ensure all of our people are kind of empowered to bring their true selves to work. And I think it's an amazing place to be, but then often, certainly with a lot of organisations, their recruitment process doesn't reflect that. So they'll have really rigid sort of stages that aren't flexible and don't kind of accommodate people. And for us, I think we want to move away from that and have kind of what we want to get out of a recruitment process, and then how can we flex that to allow people to showcase the things we're after. So whether that's, like I mentioned, our career site, having kind of all the information that people need to prepare best, driving across diversity across our interviews, so making sure that kind of our panel who do the interview process are as diverse as possible to kind of get rid of, not only just kind of remove bias and stuff, but then also candidates see how diverse we are as a business. You know, if you only meet 4 people and all of them are kind of white males of a certain age bracket, then that's your kind of expectation of what a business looks like. Whereas if your business is super diverse, it would make sense that people kind of representing the business are. We've just joined the Tech Talent Charter as a signatory, which is really cool. I'm really excited about working with them this year. They're a non-for-profit. They're like a charity that kind of support businesses on being more inclusive. So you kind of make commitments and showcase all the knowledge and stuff. Really, really looking forward to that. But I think they're our main 2 goals this year, just to try and make sure we recruit as kind of inclusively as possible, and then just shout about all the awesome stuff we do. Which sounds really straightforward when I say it like that, but it's not.
No, it isn't, and it's interesting because I think a lot of organisations that genuinely focus on the culture and internal, they are genuinely living it, and they focus so much on that they don't necessarily shout about it.
I think that's the thing, yeah, absolutely. A lot of businesses have kind of got that same headache where they've got all their focus is on doing great stuff internally, and actually people kind of want to hear about it, but they don't, because it leaves at the door, you know.
And when we spoke as well, you mentioned, just touch on, and you mentioned about the event that's ran at your place a few moments ago from some of the women in the business, and we spoke about kind of removing some of those barriers for women in and around the hiring process and progression as well. I just wondered what your kind of thoughts were on that in terms of, I don't know, wider and also within what you're doing at the moment. Yeah,
absolutely. I'm kind of all for that. I think, that certainly from kind of a gender diversity, there's so many kind of barriers and challenges to try and kind of get, you know, more women into tech and more women into great businesses. I think I did my CIPD, and there was even kind of research around how from like a school age, children are kind of, men are more predispositioned to get into sort of STEM subjects around even like the toys you give kids. So like boys are often given more physical toys to play with and like more interactive stuff, which kind of even like, which is mad from like an early, like that age, it's kind of like the system's already set up to make it harder for great women to get into tech. So I think anything businesses can do to kind of support with that more better, whether that's engaging with kind of agencies who do loads of stuff in diversity. Obviously kind of transition partners do a huge amount, or there's kind of specialist businesses that support. I know the Tech Returners, their conference they did was last week was around, but it provided free childcare for people and who attended, which is like incredible. It's not something like that just blew my mind. That was like, you come to the conference and you get free childcare, and then even as like an employer, like really allowing proper flexibility to, you know, to allow kind of families with kids and you know, women with children to get into businesses. But I think I'm all for kind of all that stuff, and I think a lot of businesses say they are kind of passionate about sort of having a diverse workforce, but a lot of the stuff they kind of put in place almost sets people up for failure from that perspective.
Yeah, and it's interesting you say that as well. I really feel from speaking with you on a number of occasions now around a real genuineness to make things right internally, and I think sometimes there's still a bit of frustration out there. And listen, nobody's perfect. You know, we are big on D&I, as you know, and we're not perfect. We're trying to make strides, and we're intentional about it. But I think there's a real frustration out there sometimes with people who they see it shouted about externally in their organisation, but internally it doesn't match.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the challenges as well is kind of when you see a lot of stuff around kind of diversity and inclusivity and all that stuff, it's typically being kind of shouted about by the groups that are discussing it. So for instance, for women in tech, it's typically been shouted about by women. And I think whilst that's amazing, kind of the real change comes from the groups that kind of are in that, majority. And I think certainly here at Answer, there's like an expectation on, shouting about having gender diversity is not just up for the kind of the genders that are underrepresented. It's more about, if everyone does it and kind of everyone gets on board, that's how real change happens. It's like, I think that's the thing. So I think at first it was a little kind of strange getting involved in sort of women and tech and kind of celebrating International Women's Day. And I'm like, I don't know, I almost felt a little bit out of my comfort zone, but it makes sense, for the kind of the masses and the majority of the people who need to shout about it, because that's how change happens.
I really like that point. And I was at the Wild event last Thursday, and Sarah Tulip came up to me asking after, and she was like, well, what did you, what's your takeaway from today? And it ties into what you were talking about, because my immediate response was a kind of a responsibility as a man there, to be an ally. Like, yes, I can't experience it necessarily as a female, but actually I've got a responsibility as somebody who's not in that group to support and advocate where I can.
100%. Yeah, I think, if you leave kind of the change down to the groups that are underrepresented, then it just holds people back and halts progress. Whereas, like you said, if you feel like you've got a kind of a responsibility as someone who's not in that, not in the underrepresented, then you've got to use that, right, to make good change.
And then, final thing I wanted to ask you, Jonny, really, with your experience and what we've discussed today, what sort of advice, would you give companies out there who are looking to improve their TA teams or practices? What are a couple of the key takeaways, really, that people could actually, scribble down a couple of notes and think, I could implement that change?
Sure. I think on a personal level, so kind of as TA professionals, like learning 100% and kind of, there's amazing communities out there. There's like Slack groups. There's amazing kind of TA authors. I've had the fortune of working with some amazing people, and I feel like all the good stuff I've done is down to sort of watching other people, learning from other people, and kind of bouncing ideas off. So I think on a personal level, find good people, buy them lots of coffee and pick their brains. And I think as a business point of view, transparency is really critical. I think, really know the business you work for, both the good and the bad, know what you stand for, what your values are, what your and more, I think most importantly, know what you want to attract, not just we need tech people or we need more diverse people. Like really dial in on, when you hire people, what do you want their values to be? What do you want them to be passionate about? And kind of know your audience, I guess. I think as a business, it's fine to have problems and headaches, and often that makes work exciting. No one wants to come up and just kind of do mundane. Everyone likes a challenge, and I think often candidates will appreciate that transparency a lot more than any amazing sales pitch, and kind of they'll rock up on day one and know that's kind of, they know what they're getting into, rather than being sold a dream and being very different when they get here. I think that's it. Just kind of transparency. I think, if you've got that sort of locked down and you know what you want to recruit for, then you'll find not only do you hire people, but they'll stay engaged and they'll stay in the business a lot more. I think certainly kind of the last few years, I've definitely gone on that journey myself, and I'm definitely more proud of some of the people I recruited in my first internal roles that are still there, 10 years ago, rather than any kind of other super impressive recruitment metric where I filled X amount of roles. It's like, actually, I look back and see them on LinkedIn and go, I must have got okay with that because they're still there. Yeah,
it shows that you've you really thought about that being the right match for them, doesn't it, I suppose? Jonny, listen, you've been fantastic. Thank you so much for joining and coming on. Really, really appreciate it. Some really insightful stuff there, especially around the values and some of the strategies in terms of TAing. So I just want to say thanks. Anybody who's listening, feel free to, I think this is okay, drop Jonny a LinkedIn and get connected with him and see what he's doing and what he's about on there. As usual, as I mentioned, any questions, just drop me an email, jermaine.benjamin@transition-partners.co.uk. Jonny, thank you very much for coming on. And,
thanks for having us, Jermaine. It's been awesome.
All right. Cheers, mate. Thank you.
Catch you soon. Take care.
All right. Thank you for listening to the Beyond Limits podcast. If you have any questions that we can answer at all on the podcast going forward, or if you would be interested in being a guest on the podcast, please email me directly at jermaine.benjamin@transition-partners.co.uk. Thanks again.